Derek Lawson had always dreamed of owning a large piece of land. He worked hard his entire life, building a successful business, and when he finally had enough money, he bought a ranch. It wasn't just any ranch, it was his slice of peace and freedom, tucked away in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Derek loved waking up early, watching the sun rise over the rolling hills, and listening to the sounds of nature. It was everything he had worked for, and it gave him a sense of pride. The ranch, which he called Lawson Acres, had been in his family for years. His ancestors had fought for their rights and built a legacy, and now Derek was continuing that legacy. The land was beautiful, with acres of open fields, a large farmhouse, and a few barns where he kept horses and cattle. It was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the noise of the world and relax. Derek knew that the neighborhood had a homeowners association, HOA, but he didn't expect them to be too involved in his life. He had heard rumors about the HOA before, but he never thought it would affect him. Most of the neighbors seemed friendly, and Derek had always kept to himself. He was a man of few words, but he liked to make a good impression. After all, this was his dream. But one morning, something changed. Derek woke up to the sound of machinery outside his window. At first, he thought it was just some construction work nearby, but when he looked outside, his stomach dropped. Workers were building a fence, a tall, white fence that stretched for miles, cutting right through his property. He couldn't believe his eyes. The workers didn't seem to notice him at first, so Derek grabbed his jacket and went outside to investigate. Derek sat in his study late that evening, surrounded by papers and legal documents. The weight of the day's meeting with the HOA was still heavy on his shoulders. He had expected them to be difficult, but their arrogance and dismissive attitude had taken him by surprise. They didn't take him seriously, and that infuriated him. But Derek wasn't the type to just give up when things got tough. He had been through too much to let a group of people with no real understanding of his struggles push him around. Derek had always known that owning a piece of land was more than just about having a place to call his own. It was about freedom, control, and the ability to stand up for what was right. Now that the HOA had backed down and agreed to remove the fence, Derek couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. It had been a long, difficult fight, but in the end, his persistence had paid off. Derek stood outside, the cool morning air wrapping around him like a blanket as he surveyed his land. The fence that had once loomed like a barrier between him and the neighborhood was gone. He could see the open field stretching out in front of him once again, just as it had been before the HOA had decided to take matters into their own hands. The workers had come early that morning, tearing down the fence piece by piece. It had been a slow process, but Derek had been patient. He wasn't just waiting for the fence to come down, he was waiting for something more. He was waiting for his victory to become real. The land was his again. The key to the gate, which had once symbolized the HOA's control over him, was now in his hand, and he knew that it gave him more than just access to the gate, it gave him the power to shape his own future. Derek had stood up for what was his, and in the end, that had made all the difference. As the workers finished clearing away the final remnants of the fence, Derek walked over to where it had once stood. He could still feel the weight of the HOA's decisions in the ground beneath his feet, but now, it felt lighter. The land was free. His land was free. Derek spent the rest of the morning walking across his property, inspecting the place that had once been under threat. He didn't need to say anything out loud, his emotions were clear in the way he moved. His footsteps were slow and deliberate as he traced the boundary where the fence had stood. He didn't have to look at the land to know how much it meant to him. It wasn't just about the property, it was about everything he had fought for. It was about reclaiming his sense of self and his sense of control. Later that afternoon, Derek decided to invite his neighbors over to celebrate the removal of the fence. It had been a difficult time, and he wanted to show them that his victory wasn't just about him. It was about standing up for the rights of everyone who had been impacted by the HOA's overreach. He knew that not everyone in the neighborhood had been on his side, But he also knew that things were starting to change. People were beginning to see that there was more to being a good neighbor than following the rules set by an organization that didn't have their best interests at heart. As his neighbors trickled in, Derek greeted each one with a firm handshake and a smile. The atmosphere was relaxed, but there was a sense of camaraderie that Derek hadn't expected. It wasn't just a celebration of the fence coming down, it was a celebration of the community coming together. People who had once looked at Derek with suspicion now saw him in a new light. They respected him. They admired him. And some of them even approached him with apologies for not standing by him sooner. "I have to admit, Derek, I didn't think you could do it," said his neighbor Joe, a middle-aged man who had lived in the neighborhood for years. "I thought the HOA had too much power, but you proved me wrong. I'm glad to see that fence gone." Derek chuckled. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about doing what was right. No one should have the right to control your land, no matter who they are. Joe nodded. "You're right. You've shown us all what it means to stand up for yourself. I can't say I agree with everything the HOA does, but I'll never look at them the same way again." Derek looked around at the other neighbors who had gathered. There were people he hadn't spoken to in years, people who had stayed quiet when the fence was first put up. But now, they were all here, sharing in the victory that had come not just through a legal battle, but through the strength of one man's resolve. As the evening wore on, the conversation shifted to the future of the neighborhood. Derek listened as people talked about the changes they'd like to see in the community. Some of them wanted to make the neighborhood more inclusive, while others wanted to find ways to improve communication between residents. But one thing was clear: Derek had inspired something in them. They had seen what could happen when someone was willing to take a stand, and they were ready to do the same. "We can't let the HOA control everything," said another neighbor, Maria. "We should be the ones deciding what happens in our own backyards. Maybe it's time we start pushing for a little more freedom around here." Derek smiled. He hadn't expected the conversation to turn in this direction, but he was glad it had. The HOA might have thought they could control everything, but Derek had shown them that people had the power to change things. It wasn't just about tearing down a fence, it was about tearing down the walls that kept people from speaking up. Later in the evening, as the last of the guests were leaving, Derek stood by the bonfire in his yard, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. The flames flickered in the cool night air, and for the first time in weeks, Derek felt completely at ease. The battle was over, but the fight had been worth it. He had taken control of his land, and in doing so, he had taken control of his future. The next morning, Derek walked out to the gate, holding the key in his hand once again. He turned it slowly in the lock, feeling the cool metal against his fingers. The gate swung open easily, just as it always had, but this time, Derek felt something different. It wasn't just a gate, it was a symbol. The key to the gate wasn't just something that opened and closed, it represented his strength, his determination, and his refusal to be controlled. Derek took a deep breath and stepped out onto the land that was his. The fence was gone. The HOA's power over him was gone. And with it, Derek had gained something more valuable than any piece of property or any gate key. He had gained the confidence to stand up for what he believed in. As he walked across the land, Derek knew that the road ahead would have its challenges. There would always be people who tried to push their agenda, to impose their rules on others. But Derek was no longer afraid. He had learned that the greatest battles weren't fought with fists or words, they were fought with the strength to say, "No, this is mine. And I'm not going to let anyone take it from me." With the sun setting on his ranch, Derek looked out at the land one last time that day. The fence was gone. The HOA was no longer in control. And Derek was free. The fence that had once loomed over his property was now coming down. Workers arrived early one morning, carefully dismantling the barrier that had divided Derek's land from the rest of the neighborhood. Derek stood at the edge of his property, watching as the pieces of wood and wire were removed. He didn't feel joy, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The fence had been more than just an eyesore. It had been a symbol of the HOA's attempt to control his life. Now, it was being torn down, piece by piece. As the workers finished their task, Derek approached the area where the fence had once stood. The land, once confined by the tall, white structure, now felt open and free. He could see the horizon clearly again, just as it had been before the HOA had decided to impose their will on him. Derek walked across the land, taking in the view. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. But the battle wasn't just about the fence. Derek had made it clear to the HOA that he wasn't someone they could push around. He wasn't someone who would accept their authority without question. The experience had taught him something important about standing up for himself, about refusing to back down when the odds were stacked against him. And as he stood on his land, looking at the place that had once been under threat, he knew that the fight had been worth it. The next day, Derek invited his neighbors over for a small gathering to celebrate the removal of the fence. He wanted to show them that he wasn't just a man who fought for his own rights, he was a man who cared about the community. Over the past few weeks, he had spoken to several of them about the HOA and the way it had tried to control his property. Some of his neighbors had been supportive, while others had sided with the HOA, believing that the fence was necessary for the neighborhood's appearance. The turnout for the gathering was greater than Derek expected. As the guests arrived, they were greeted with food, drinks, and a sense of camaraderie. The atmosphere was warm, and people were eager to hear about the events that had led to the fence's removal. Derek stood by the bonfire, speaking with his neighbors and sharing his story. Some were surprised at how far he had gone to fight for his land, but many were impressed. They hadn't realized just how much power the HOA had and how much power Derek had taken back. "Derek, I have to admit, I didn't think you could pull it off," said his neighbor, Joe, who lived 2 houses down. "You really gave the HOA a run for their money. I'm glad to see that the fence is gone. It never really made sense to me in the first place." Derek smiled. It wasn't just about the fence. It was about standing up for what's right. No one should be able to just decide what happens to your land without your consent. Joe nodded in agreement. "You're right about that. You've shown us all that sometimes, it's worth fighting for what you believe in. I'm glad you did." As the evening wore on, Derek looked around at the people gathered on his land. He had earned their respect not through force, but through his determination. The HOA had tried to divide him from his neighbors, but in the end, it had brought them closer together. People who had once viewed Derek as just another neighbor were now seeing him as someone who stood up for his rights and for the community. The conversation turned to the future of the neighborhood. Derek knew that the HOA still existed, but he had made it clear that he wasn't afraid to challenge their decisions. The idea of an advisory board, which they had offered him in the past, seemed less appealing now. Derek didn't need to be a part of their system. He had proven that he could make a difference without their help. "I don't need to be on the board to make change," Derek said as he raised his glass. "I just need to stand my ground, and that's exactly what I plan to do." The neighbors cheered, and Derek felt a sense of pride wash over him. He wasn't just a landowner, he was a symbol of resilience. He had faced the HOA's attempts to control his land, and he had come out victorious. And now, as he stood among his neighbors, he realized that he had done more than just remove a fence. He had brought people together. The next morning, as Derek walked around his property, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had faced the challenge head-on, and he had come out on top. But more than that, he had learned something important about himself, that sometimes, the greatest victories aren't just about winning, they're about standing up for what's right, even when the odds are against you. As he stood by the gate that led to his property, Derek couldn't help but smile. He had the key now, not just to his land, but to his future. The fence was gone, and with it, the HOA's hold on his life. Derek was free. And he would never let anyone take that away from him. The days following Derek's strategic move were tense. The HOA board members, once so sure of their control, were now rattled. Word had spread through the neighborhood, and people were starting to talk. Some of them were sympathetic to Derek's cause, while others remained loyal to the HOA's rules. But Derek wasn't concerned with public opinion. He had already achieved what he set out to do. As the days passed, Derek could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The once smooth-running operations of the HOA were starting to show cracks. They had underestimated Derek, and now, it was clear that they were not in control. Derek had the key to the gate, the only key, and he knew that was enough to force the HOA to take him seriously. One afternoon, while Derek was tending to his ranch, he received a call from his lawyer, Greg. Derek wiped his hands on his jeans and answered the phone. "Derek, it's Greg. I just wanted to give you a heads up. The HOA has decided to have a meeting to discuss the situation," Greg said, his voice serious. "They're realizing that their position is becoming untenable, and they want to talk about a potential solution." Derek's lips curled into a small smile. He had expected this. The HOA's arrogance had finally caught up with them, and now they were coming to him. It was a sign that they knew they were on the losing side. "All right, I'm listening," Derek said, his tone calm but firm. "They're going to send you an invitation. It's up to you whether you want to meet or not, but I'm sure they'll want to offer a compromise." "They don't want to push this any further," Greg replied. Derek thought for a moment. He didn't want to give in too easily, but at the same time, he wasn't going to let them walk away without showing them he wasn't just a man with a ranch, he was a force to be reckoned with. "I'll meet with them. But I'm going in with a clear goal. I'm not backing down, Greg. Let them know that." Greg chuckled. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you, Derek. I'll make sure they know you're not someone who's easily intimidated." The following day, Derek received the formal invitation to the meeting. It was polite and professional, but the tone was unmistakable. The HOA was offering a chance to resolve the situation, but it was clear that they were the ones in need of a solution. Derek wasn't sure what kind of compromise they had in mind, but he was prepared for anything. When the day of the meeting arrived, Derek made his way to the HOA office once again. This time, however, the atmosphere felt different. The board members were no longer the confident figures they once were. As Derek walked into the meeting room, he noticed that they seemed tense, uneasy even. The balding board member, who had been the most dismissive during their first meeting, greeted him with a forced smile. "Mr. Lawson, thank you for coming. We appreciate your willingness to meet with us." Derek nodded but didn't offer a smile in return. He had no intention of making things easy for them. "Let's get to the point," Derek said, his voice steady. "You know why I'm here. I'm not going to waste time with pleasantries." The tall, thin board member cleared his throat. "Of course. Mr. Lawson, we've had some internal discussions, and we've come to the conclusion that the situation has become more complicated than we originally anticipated. We recognize that the fence is an issue, and we want to find a way to resolve it." Derek leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the board members. "I've been clear from the beginning. I didn't ask for the fence, and I don't want it. The HOA overstepped its boundaries, and now you're dealing with the consequences." The balding man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at his colleagues for support. "We understand your frustration, Mr. Lawson. And we recognize that the fence has caused a lot of tension. What we're proposing is that we come to an agreement. We'll remove the fence, but in exchange, we'd like you to consider becoming a part of the HOA's advisory board." Derek raised an eyebrow. This wasn't what he had expected. The idea of joining the HOA's advisory board was tempting, but Derek wasn't sure he wanted to align himself with an organization that had caused him so much trouble. "You want me to join your board? After everything that's happened? We believe that with your experience and your insight, you could help guide the HOA in a more positive direction, the thin man said. Your voice would carry weight, and we think it would be beneficial for everyone involved. Derek leaned back in his chair, processing their offer. It was clear that they were trying to regain control of the situation, but Derek wasn't sure if this was the solution he was looking for. He had no interest in becoming part of their broken system. However, he also recognized that they were desperate. I'll consider your offer, Derek said, his voice calm. But only if you take down the fence immediately. The fence stays up only as long as I say so. You don't get to decide that anymore. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear that they hadn't expected Derek to have such a strong response. They had assumed that their offer would be enough to placate him, but they were wrong. Mr. Lawson, the balding man began, we understand that you're upset. But you have to understand, the fence was built with the best intentions. We've been trying to maintain a sense of order in the community. Derek shook his head. Order? You've been trying to control my land without my permission. And now you want to act like I should be grateful? No, I won't be a part of your system. I'm here to take control of my own land, not to become one of you. There was a long silence as the board members realized that they were running out of options. Derek had outplayed them at every turn, and now they had no choice but to back down. After a few moments, the thin man spoke again, his voice quieter this time. We'll remove the fence, Mr. Lawson. But we ask that you give us some time to work on the details of your involvement with the advisory board. Derek stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. You'll take the fence down, and you'll do it quickly. As for the advisory board, don't bother. You've already shown me what kind of organization you are. I don't need to be a part of it. With that, Derek turned and walked out of the meeting room, leaving the board members stunned. He had won. The HOA had realized that they couldn't control him, and now they were left to clean up the mess they had made. Derek's land was his once again, and he had made sure that the HOA would never forget who had the real power. As he stared at the papers spread out on his desk, Derek began to think of his next steps. The HOA had told him that the fence was staying and that the only option for him was to submit a formal complaint. He didn't want to play their game. He didn't want to wait around for their approval. Derek needed to take action, but he knew he had to be smart about it. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, thinking about the neighborhood and the HOA. Over the past few days, Derek had done some digging into the HOA's history. He had learned that the organization was struggling financially and was under pressure to sell off some of its properties. Derek had even overheard a conversation between two of the board members at a local cafe, where they had discussed the HOA's debts. That's when the idea struck him. What if he could use their financial troubles to his advantage? He grabbed his phone and began researching the available properties that the HOA was selling. He didn't have to look far. There was one piece of land in particular that caught his eye. It was the small plot of land next to his ranch, the one where the fence had been built. According to the documents, the HOA was desperate to offload it, and the price was well below market value. Derek smiled to himself. This could be the opportunity he needed to turn the situation around. If he could buy that piece of land, he would not only gain control over the fence but also acquire the key to the only gate that connected the fence to the rest of the neighborhood. It was a brilliant move, one that would force the HOA to reckon with him. The next morning, Derek contacted his lawyer, Greg. Greg was a no-nonsense type of guy who had helped Derek with legal matters in the past. After a quick phone call, they set up a meeting to discuss Derek's plan. Greg listened carefully as Derek explained what he had discovered about the HOA's financial situation and the piece of land up for sale. You're sure the HOA is willing to sell it? Greg asked, tapping a pen on the table. I'm sure, Derek replied. I've done my homework. They need the money, and this plot of land is one of their biggest liabilities. If I can buy it, I'll control the gate, and I'll have the leverage to make them take down the fence. Greg raised an eyebrow. It's a bold move, Derek. But it might just work. I'll draw up the paperwork and start the negotiations. If everything checks out, you'll be the owner of that land. Over the next few days, Derek worked with Greg to gather the necessary information and finalize the deal. They made an offer to the HOA, and after some back and forth negotiations, Derek's bid was accepted. The HOA had no choice but to sell the land to Derek at a price that worked in his favor. It was a huge victory, one that Derek knew would change everything. Derek was now the proud owner of the land next to his ranch. With it came the only gate key to the fence that had been built around his property. He couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as he stood in front of the gate, holding the key in his hand. This was his land, his key, and no one could take that away from him. But Derek didn't stop there. He knew that owning the land and the key wasn't enough. He had to make the HOA understand that he wasn't someone they could push around. He wasn't just a man who owned a piece of land, he was a man who knew how to use his resources and his intelligence to get what he wanted. The following week, Derek invited the HOA board members to a meeting at his ranch. He wanted them to see the situation from his perspective and to understand that he had the upper hand. He wasn't just going to stand by while they trampled over his rights. When the board members arrived, Derek led them through the gate and into the area where the fence had been built. The tall, white fence loomed over them, a constant reminder of the HOA's attempt to control him. He could see the discomfort in their faces as they looked at the fence, but Derek didn't say anything. He simply stood there, letting them take it all in. After a few moments, the balding board member spoke up. "Mr. Lawson, I don't understand why you're making such a big deal out of this. The fence is harmless. It's for the good of the community." Derek smiled, his eyes glinting with determination. "You're right about one thing, it is for the good of the community. But I've come to realize that what you're really doing is trying to control people. You thought you could just put up a fence around my property and I would accept it. But I'm not like the others." The board members shifted uncomfortably, but Derek didn't stop. "I bought the land next to my ranch, the land where this fence is. I now own the only gate key. And I'm going to keep it that way." There was a long pause as the board members processed the news. Derek could see the realization dawn on them. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected him to fight back so strategically. Derek wasn't just some passive landowner who would bend to their will. He was a man who understood how to use his power. "So, what does that mean for us?" the stranger board member asked. Derek leaned in, his voice steady and firm. "It means that the fence stays up, but not because you say so. I control the gate, and I'll decide when or if it gets taken down. The fence is a reminder that you can't just push people around." The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Derek could see that they were beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. He had won. He had taken control, and now, the HOA was at his mercy. As the meeting ended, Derek stood tall, feeling a sense of triumph. He had used his intelligence, his resources, and his determination to turn the tables on the HOA. He wasn't just a man with a ranch anymore, he was a man who had taken charge of his own destiny. As he walked closer, one of the workers stopped and nodded at him. "Good morning, sir. We're just putting in a new fence around the property line, as per HOA guidelines," the worker said, almost as if this was a routine task. Derek sat in his car, staring at the HOA office building. He had been here before, but today felt different. His mind raced as he thought about the fence that had been built around his property. He had never asked for it, and yet, it was there cutting off his land from the rest of the neighborhood. The HOA had made it clear that their decision was final, but Derek wasn't about to let it go without a fight. He wasn't going to let anyone walk all over him. He stepped out of the car, adjusting his jacket and taking a deep breath. As he walked through the front doors of the HOA office, the receptionist looked up at him with a blank expression. Derek wasn't surprised. He had dealt with her before. She had always been cold and distant, a reflection of the bureaucracy he was up against. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but uninviting. "I'm here to speak with someone about the fence that was put up around my property," Derek replied, trying to keep his voice calm. She tapped a few keys on her keyboard before looking back at him. "You'll need to speak with the board members about that. I'll set up an appointment for you." Derek wasn't interested in waiting for an appointment. He had been waiting long enough. "No, I want to speak with them now. This is urgent." The receptionist gave him a long, scrutinizing look but then picked up the phone. She spoke to someone on the other end and then hung up. "Please wait here," she said, gesturing to the seating area. Derek nodded and sat down, his mind swirling with frustration. He hated being put in a position where he had to fight for what was his, but he knew this wasn't just about a fence anymore. This was about standing up for his rights. Minutes felt like hours as he sat there, listening to the faint hum of office phones and the rustle of papers. He wasn't sure what to expect when he finally spoke with the HOA board, but he knew he had to be ready for anything. He wasn't going to back down just because they held the power. He had power too. His power came from the land he owned, from the sweat and effort he had put into building his life. Finally, the receptionist called him back into a small meeting room. Inside, 3 men sat around a table, looking at him as if he were an inconvenience. Derek recognized 2 of them from the neighborhood, but the third man was a stranger. He couldn't help but feel that they were all more interested in their own convenience than in what was right. "Mr. Lawson, please have a seat," said one of the men, a short, balding fellow with glasses. He motioned to an empty chair. Derek didn't sit right away. He stood by the table, feeling the weight of the moment. He was ready for a fight. "I don't appreciate the way this was handled. You built a fence around my property without my consent. That's not how things should work." The 3 men exchanged glances. The balding man spoke again, his voice firm but not unkind. "We understand your frustration, Mr. Lawson. However, the decision to build the fence was made by the board after several complaints from the community. We felt it was necessary to maintain the neighborhood's aesthetic standards." Derek shook his head. "I don't care about your aesthetic standards. This is my land. My home. You didn't consult me, and that's a problem. I'm not just going to accept it." The stranger, who Derek now recognized as a newer board member, cleared his throat. "Perhaps you misunderstand. This isn't about personal preferences. This is about upholding the rules that everyone in the neighborhood agreed to when they moved in. The HOA is responsible for maintaining a certain level of uniformity. It's a simple matter of property values." Derek felt his blood begin to boil, but he kept his composure. He wasn't going to let them make him feel small. "Uniformity? You're telling me that my property doesn't look good enough for your standards? I've put years of work into my ranch. It's not just some piece of land. It's my life's work." One of the men, a tall, thin man with a sharp nose, leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Mr. Lawson, we understand you've invested a lot into your property. But the HOA has guidelines that must be followed. If you have issues with the fence, you can submit a formal complaint, and we'll review it. But the decision has already been made." Derek stood up straight, not willing to let them dismiss him so easily. "So that's it? You put up a fence around my property without even talking to me, and now you're telling me there's nothing I can do about it?" The balding man tried to stay calm, but there was a hint of frustration in his voice. "It's not that simple. We've made this decision for the good of the community. We believe it will improve the neighborhood. The fence will be removed only if we find a compelling reason to do so after a formal review process." Derek wasn't ready to give up yet. "What happens if I refuse to accept this? What happens if I refuse to let you control what happens to my land?" The three men exchanged uncertain looks. It was clear they hadn't expected him to push back so hard. The balding man spoke again, his tone more guarded. "Mr. Lawson, we're not trying to control your property. We're simply enforcing the guidelines that have been in place for years. If you don't want the fence, we can review your complaint. But it's not as simple as just tearing it down." Derek clenched his fists, trying to keep himself from exploding. He knew he wasn't going to get the answer he wanted today. But he also knew that this fight wasn't over. He wasn't going to back down just because they had the power to make decisions. He had power too, the power of his property, his rights, and the strength of his will. As he turned to leave the room, he spoke one last time. "This isn't over. I'll be looking into my options. And I won't stop until you've removed that fence." The men didn't reply, and Derek knew they had no idea what he was capable of. He had come to the HOA office expecting a fight, and now, he had his fight. It was just beginning. Derek stared at him in disbelief. "What do you mean, as per HOA guidelines?" "I didn't approve any of this," he said, trying to stay calm. The worker shrugged. "Sorry, sir. We're just following orders. The HOA decided it was necessary to build a fence around the properties to improve the neighborhood's appearance. You'll need to speak with them if you have any issues." With a sinking feeling in his chest, Derek turned and walked back to his house. This wasn't just an inconvenience, this was an outright invasion. The fence wasn't just around his land, it was practically swallowing it up, separating him from the rest of the neighborhood. Derek had spent years building his ranch, and now it felt like someone was trying to erase it. He immediately went inside and called the HOA office. After being placed on hold for what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke with a representative. "Hello, this is Derek Lawson, and I just found out that a fence is being built around my property. Can you tell me why this was done without my permission?" The representative, a woman with a polite but distant voice, explained that the HOA had decided to install the fence as part of a new initiative to enhance the aesthetic value of the neighborhood. "It's part of the new neighborhood regulations," she said. "All properties are being enclosed to make sure everything looks uniform." Derek's frustration grew. "I didn't agree to any of this. I don't need a fence, and I certainly don't want one on my land," he said, his voice rising with irritation. "Well, sir," the representative replied, "the HOA board approved it. You'll need to submit a formal complaint if you want to challenge the decision. I can't help you with that." That was it. Derek felt a wave of anger wash over him, but he kept his cool. He didn't want to escalate the situation just yet. "Fine," he said, "I'll be speaking with someone about this." He hung up the phone, his mind racing. Derek knew the HOA had a reputation for being controlling, but this was something else. He had worked hard for everything he had, and now it felt like the HOA was taking it all away from him. He thought about his neighbors, people who had lived there for years, people who probably supported the HOA's decision. Was this how they all felt? Did they have to put up with this constant oversight, this feeling of being watched and controlled? The workers continued their work, completely ignoring Derek as he paced around his property, trying to make sense of what was happening. His property was supposed to be his sanctuary, a place where he could relax, but now it felt like a prison. By the end of the day, the fence was nearly complete. Derek stood on his porch and looked out at the stark white barrier that now surrounded his ranch. He couldn't believe it. It was as if the HOA thought they could just come in and take over, without even consulting him. He knew he had to do something. But what? Derek wasn't a man to back down easily. He had spent his whole life fighting for what was rightfully his, and this was no different. He wasn't going to let some faceless HOA members decide what happened to his land. The next morning, Derek drove to the HOA office, determined to get some answers. As he entered the building, he was greeted by a receptionist who seemed uninterested in his presence. Derek explained the situation, and the receptionist reluctantly directed him to a meeting with one of the HOA board members. Sitting in the boardroom, Derek felt a sense of unease. The members were polite, but there was an air of superiority about them. They acted as if they were doing him a favor by even listening to his concerns. Derek felt his temper rise again, but he held it in check. He was determined to handle this calmly and professionally. "Gentlemen," Derek began, his voice steady but firm, "I don't appreciate the fact that you've built a fence around my property without my consent. I've worked hard for everything I have, and I'm not going to let anyone take it from me." The board members exchanged glances, then one of them spoke. "Mr. Lawson, this is a decision made by the board. It's for the greater good of the neighborhood. We've received numerous complaints about properties not being in line with our aesthetic guidelines. The fence is simply to ensure uniformity." Derek shook his head. "Uniformity? This is my land. I didn't ask for a fence, and I didn't agree to one. This is my home, and I want it to remain that way." The board member gave a dismissive wave. "You can submit a formal complaint if you wish, but this decision has already been made. The fence stays." That was the moment Derek knew that he would have to fight. This wasn't just about a fence, it was about respect, about his rights as a landowner. The HOA thought they could push him around, but Derek wasn't one to back down. He would find a way to take control of the situation, no matter what it took.